I'm Professor Steve Johnson at Mercer Law School, and this video is part of a series of videos that review important statutory and administrative law cases covered in my statutory law course source. In this video, I'll be discussing National Cable and Telecommunications Association versus Brand X Internet Services, although most folks just refer to the case as Brand X. So this case focuses on the deference owed to agencies' interpretations of statutes when courts have already interpreted the statutes. In the full opinion, the court goes into some detail parsing the language of the statute, but in the course source, I've edited a lot of that out in order to focus more narrowly on the big issue that the court resolved in the case regarding the conflict between Chevron and stare decisis. So my discussion of the case in this video is also going to be limited to that aspect of the case. So let's start with some background about the case before we get into the court's opinion. The dispute in the case centered on whether cable television companies that sold broadband internet services were providing telecommunication services under the Communications Act of 1934. Now, on the slide, I've listed the statutory definitions for telecommunication service and information service, as well as the definition for telecommunications, since the term is used in the definition of telecommunication services. In the case, as I mentioned, the court went into extended discussion about the meaning and scope of those terms. But I'm not going to talk about that portion of the opinion in detail. I'm just reproducing the definitions here to help put the dispute in context. Now, the definition of telecommunications service was important in the case because if an entity was providing telecommunication services under the statute, it could be regulated under the statute by the FCC as a common carrier. Now, the reason why that's going to be important is going to be apparent in a couple minutes when I get to that. Okay. So in order to understand the case a little better, it's going to help to talk a little bit about who the parties are that are involved in the litigation and what they're concerned about. Well, the case is all about access to the internet and involves all of the different companies involved in providing access to the internet, at least at the time of the case. So who were the players? Well, one group of players in the case were the internet service providers, the ISPs, like Brand X Internet Services. You may not know Brand X, but you may have heard of companies like America Online and CompuServe. They used to be very popular at the beginning of the internet era. Those companies are companies that consumers would contract with in order to get access to the internet. ISPs helped consumers get access to the internet, but ISPs didn't own the telecommunication lines that consumers used to actually connect to the internet. Instead, most consumers contracted with an ISP to access the internet and then connected to the internet through the traditional phone lines, which transmitted both voice and data. The phone companies, and I've got them right here, telephone companies were regulated under the Communications Act as common carriers because they were providing telecommunication services. Okay. Now, over time, folks got tired of the slow speed of internet access, and technology improved, and there were new ways to access the internet, called broadband access to the internet. The phone companies were one of those ways. Phone companies installed high-speed telephone lines called DSL lines as one way to access the internet faster. When they did that, they were still regulated under the Communications Act as common carriers because they were providing communication services as well as the information services. So we've got telephone companies down here as one of the other players, providing both dial-up and broadband. Now, as the phone companies were rolling out DSL, Cable television operators were providing this faster broadband access to the internet through their cable television lines at speeds that were much faster than either the traditional dial-up or DSL. But the cable companies, were not being regulated as common carriers under the Communications Act. Okay, well, with that background about the players, I want to return to the point about common carrier regulation that I alluded to before. Okay, under the Communications Act, a common carrier, like the phone companies like AT&T, is required to allow third parties like the ISPs to send data over their telephone lines. The phone companies can charge the ISPs reasonable fees to use the phone lines, but they can't prevent them from using the phone lines. So that's why the ISPs and the phone companies wanted cable television companies that are providing broadband access to the internet to be regulated as common carriers. If the cable companies were common carriers, then ISPs could contract with their customers who could then use the cable company's lines to access the internet. And consumers would be paying the ISPs for the access to the internet instead of paying the cable companies. So that's why the ISPs wanted the cable companies to be regulated as common carriers. The phone companies wanted the cable companies to be regulated as common carriers because the cable companies were direct competitors to the phone companies, but they weren't being subjected to the same rules and requirements as common carriers when they were providing internet access. So those are the players, and that's why there was all this focus on whether the cable companies were common carriers, whether they were providing telecommunications services and should therefore be regulated as common carriers under the statute. So what happened that led to the dispute in the case that ended up in the Supreme Court? Well, everything began in 2000 in a Ninth Circuit case, AT&T versus Portland. That lawsuit was between two private parties, and it didn't involve the FCC. But the court in that case did have to decide whether cable companies providing broadband internet access were providing telecommunication services under the Communications Act. And the court concluded they were. So the Ninth Circuit in 2000 interpreted the Communications Act, and they interpreted it to mean that the cable companies were providing telecommunication services so they could be regulated as common carriers. Now, a couple years later, in 2002, the FCC got involved, and they issued an order after rulemaking finding that cable companies providing internet services were not providing telecommunication services. So they're interpreting the same statute that the Ninth Circuit had, but they come to the opposite conclusion after the Ninth Circuit had reached their conclusion. Okay, so the ISPs who liked the AT&T decision, don't like the 2002 FCC rule, challenged the FCC rule in the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, because that's where you can challenge the rule under the statute. So since the court in the Ninth Circuit was reviewing an agency's statutory interpretation through a legislative rule developed through notice and comment rulemaking, the court normally would have applied the Chevron analysis to review the agency's rule, because that was the classic scenario for Chevron. Legislative rule, notice and comment rulemaking, interpreting a statute. That was the context in which Chevron itself was decided. So Ninth Circuit normally, when the ISPs challenged the rule, would have applied Chevron. However, the Ninth Circuit held that because it had previously decided in 2000 in the AT&T versus Portland case that cable companies were providing telecommunication services, it was bound by stare decisis to reach that same conclusion now, and they wouldn't use Chevron to review the agency's interpretation of the statute. The court would just rely on stare decisis and uphold the precedent from 2000. So that Ninth Circuit decision was then appealed to the Supreme Court. So the question for the court at that time then was whether the Ninth Circuit was bound by the prior decision because of stare decisis when reviewing the FCC's rule, or whether the Ninth Circuit should have reviewed the FCC's rule under Chevron. So in short, the court had to decide how to resolve a conflict between stare decisis and Chevron. Would the court give deference to the agency's interpretation of the statute under Chevron when the court had previously interpreted the statute itself? Or did the court's prior interpretation of the statute settle the matter under stare decisis and deprive the agency of the authority to interpret the statute differently? So, how did the court resolve the conflict? Well, as you can see in my slide here, the court, in essence, with some caveats here, held that Chevron took precedence. Not in every case, but in general, that Chevron was going to control. Well, what precisely did the court say? Well, what the majority said was a prior judicial construction of a statute trumps an agency construction otherwise entitled to Chevron deference only if the prior court decision holds that its construction follows from the unambiguous terms of the statute and thus leaves no room for agency discretion. Okay, that's a little confusing, so we're going to walk through that. Okay, what it means, though, is that the court needs to look at the manner in which the court analyzed the statute in the precedent case. So if you've got a precedent case and now the court's asked to interpret the statute again after an agency has interpreted the statute, the court has to go back and look at the precedent case. And the way that the court interpreted the statute in the precedent case is going to impact whether Chevron applies or not. So if the court in the precedent case in interpreting the statute found the statute was clear and had a specific meaning, then that precedent decision is going to be applied when the court is reviewing the agency's subsequent interpretation of the statute. So in that situation, the agency won't get any deference under Chevron, and the agency can't interpret the statute differently from the way the court did because the court said the statute was clear. So stare decisis will control. But that's only if in the prior interpretation, the prior decision, the court said the statute's clear. Now, if on the other hand, we go back and we look at the prior precedent and we look at the prior interpretation of the statute by the court, if the court in that case found that the statute was ambiguous, but that the statute should be interpreted in a particular manner, then the agency's got more power, okay? Because then when the agency subsequently interprets the statute, the court reviewing the agency's interpretation will apply Chevron, okay? If it's a situation where Chevron applies, right? Which in this case was the classic Chevron scenario, legislative rulemaking, notice of comment, okay? So looking back here, when the court initially interprets the statute in a particular way after finding it's ambiguous, then the agency can reinterpret it in a different way, and the court will apply Chevron to decide whether the agency's interpretation gets upheld or not. So this is where Chevron is going to trump stare decisis. So again, the big idea here is that we look back at the precedent case. If the precedent case said the statute was clear, then stare decisis is going to apply. If the precedent case said the statute's ambiguous, then Chevron applies and stare decisis doesn't. So To some extent, it seemed like the court was saying that agencies can ignore or even overturn judicial interpretations of a statute. At least Scalia seemed to argue that that's what they were doing. So how did the court justify that holding? Well, a couple ways. First of all, they relied on the reasoning of Chevron. The court suggested that its holding was consistent with the underlying reasoning of Chevron, which created a presumption that Congress, when it left an ambiguity in the statute, meant for implementation by the agency, understood that ambiguity would be resolved first and foremost by the agency and not courts. So if the court refused to accord the agency Chevron deference in cases where the statutory language was ambiguous, it would be allowing courts to have precedence over agencies in interpreting statutes. And that would be inconsistent with Chevron. So they said this rule we're adopting in this case is consistent with Chevron. Because remember, in this case, they're only ignoring the precedent if the precedent said that the statute was ambiguous, right? If the precedent says the statute is clear, then we don't ignore the precedent. Okay, so that was one of the rationales here for the majority's decision in Brand X. Now, the second rationale that the court provided for its decision was that a contrary holding, right? If the court found that the court's decision would take precedence because it was issued first, if they adopted that holding, that would lead to this anomalous result where the decision about which interpretation the courts, the agencies would control will be based on who made the decision first and not based on who had more expertise or who Congress intended to make the decision. So that would mean that there would be this incentive for the agency to make a decision quickly, and there would be the race to the decision because the agency would know that if they made the decision quickly, then they could make a decision before the court decided. Because once the court decided, if the court held in Brand X that the court's decision came first, then it would get precedence, then the agency would know we got to decide before the court decides. So that was another reason why the court didn't go that route. And then finally, the majority says that they raised this concern that Justice Scalia raised in his dissent in U.S. versus Meade. The court said that limiting an agency's authority to overturn a court's interpretation of an ambiguous statute would lead to ossification of statutory law, and that principles of law would be hardwired in place and couldn't be changed without new legislation. So for all of those reasons, the court said, that's why we have adopted the rule that we did in Brand X. Now, having established that new rule that resolved this conflict between stare decisis and Chevron, the Brand X court still had to apply it, right? They still now had to decide what had the precedent case in AT&T versus Portland held, right? So they looked at that, and they decided when they looked at AT&T versus Portland that the court concluded that the Ninth Circuit didn't decide in AT&T versus Portland that the statute was clear. So even though the AT&T versus Portland court held that the Communications Act regulated cable companies as communications, providing telecommunication services, they did that because the statute was ambiguous, and the Ninth Circuit thought that it was a better reading of the statute. So going back to the Brand X rule, that means that we apply Chevron now to the agency's interpretation. We don't simply apply stare decisis. But again, the case isn't over, right? Because we still have to apply Chevron to the FCC's interpretation of the statute. We can ignore an AT&T versus Portland, but we do have to apply Chevron to decide whether the agency's interpretation of the Communications Act is reasonable under Chevron. Okay, so in part 4 of the court's opinion, and this is the part that I told you I had edited out in my course materials, okay? This is the rather rigorous discussion of the language of the statute and Chevron. So in part 4 of the opinion, the court applied the Chevron analysis and it upheld the FCC's rule finding that the cable companies were not providing telecommunication services. So that was the majority approach in the case. There were dissents, right? Justice Scalia, Souter, and Ginsburg dissented from the court's decision, arguing that the statute was clear that cable companies are providing telecommunication services. And because it was clear, the Ninth Circuit's decision would have been correct, even if stare decisis didn't apply here. So they said that the statute was clear and that the agency got it wrong. So even if we were applying Chevron, they would have decided at step 1 that the statute was clear and we wouldn't defer to the agency. Now, Justice Scalia raised additional points in his dissent, but Justice Souter and Ginsburg didn't join him in these additional points. But they were Chevron related, as he was frequently likely to do in his dissents. So Scalia argued, as he did in other Chevron dissents, that courts should defer under Chevron to agency interpretations as long as they are authoritative interpretations from an agency head. So he was saying that that's another reason why Chevron should apply here. He also argued that the majority's approach didn't make sense because he said it created a system where judicial decisions were subject to reversal by executive orders, a system which he said was potentially unconstitutional. Now, the majority disagrees, saying that if the statute's ambiguous, agencies rather than courts have the final say on the interpretation of the statute. So the court's interpretation is not binding in the first place, and the agency is not reversing a judicial interpretation. So you don't have the executive branch here usurping the role of the judicial branch, contrary to Scalia's argument. But that's a dialogue that you saw going back and forth between the majority and the dissent here on the separation of powers. So that, in a nutshell, is a brief summary of the Brand X decision and the resolution of this conflict between stare decisis and Chevron. So thank you very much for watching.